When we talk about India's position in the world today, what happened at the Alaska summit cannot be ignored. For decades, India was seen as a nation in transition, always developing, always catching up, but never quite at the center of the global chessboard. And yet, in Alaska, for the first time in modern history, we witnessed India stepping into the room not as a spectator, not as a junior partner, but as a power broker. That word, power broker, carries weight. It means you are no longer waiting for others to decide your future. You are the one others look to before they make their own moves, and that is exactly what happened. India arrived at the summit with something far more powerful than military strength or economic statistics. It arrived with credibility that was built over years of independent decision-making, of not bending entirely toward one superpower or another, but choosing its own path. That credibility is what turned heads. And that credibility is what forced the United States and China, the two giants who dominated the table, to recognize that nothing could move forward without India's input. Think about that for a moment. For years, geopolitics has been described as a tug-of-war between Washington and Beijing, two poles pulling the world into their spheres of influence. But what the Alaska summit revealed is that the rope is not just being pulled from two ends anymore. There is a third force holding it steady, redirecting the balance, and that force is India. That is not a small development. That is a seismic shift in how the world operates. Now, here is the deeper truth. Power is not just about size. It is not about how many tanks or how many missiles a nation has. Real power is psychological. It is the perception of influence. It is the ability to walk into a room and have others pause before they speak, to calculate how their words will sound in your presence. And at the Alaska summit, India achieved exactly that. The symbolism was extraordinary. India's representatives were not merely present, they were essential. Every sentence, every negotiation, every future plan had to take into account where India stood. That is what it means to be a power broker, and this is not just about politics. This is about identity. For too long, India was told to stay in its lane, to be patient, to play the role of the emerging nation that one day might matter. But the truth is, India matters today. The summit was proof that India is not on the sidelines, it is on the main stage. This changes the way Indians see themselves. It changes the way the next generation of leaders, entrepreneurs, and thinkers approach their place in the world. When your nation is recognized as central to global strategy, it gives you permission to dream bigger, to take risks, to demand more from yourself. I want you to imagine this in personal terms. Imagine being the person in a meeting who used to sit quietly, waiting for instructions, hoping to be noticed. Then one day you realize the entire room is looking at you, waiting for your decision before they make theirs. That moment changes everything. It changes how you carry yourself, how you speak, how you believe in your own worth. That is exactly what happened to India in Alaska. The psychological transformation is as important as the geopolitical one. But let's be clear, with power comes responsibility. Being a power broker is not just about enjoying the applause. It means you cannot afford to be reckless. You cannot afford to play the game casually. It means you must be precise, disciplined, and consistent, because the world is watching every move. India cannot simply celebrate this recognition. It must live up to it. It must continue to build alliances without losing independence, to pursue growth without compromising values, to remain strong without becoming arrogant. And this is where the philosophical lesson comes in. Power is not given, it is earned, and it is not permanent, it must be maintained. The Alaska summit was a milestone, but it is not the finish line. It is the beginning of a new era where India is expected to lead. And leadership requires courage, it requires clarity, it requires the willingness to make difficult choices that may not please everyone but serve the greater vision. That greater vision is what will determine whether this moment becomes a historical footnote or the foundation of a new chapter. India has the chance to redefine the very architecture of global power, to say, we are not here to take sides, we are here to set the terms. That is a bold statement, but it is a statement the world is ready to hear. Because in an age where conflict and mistrust dominate, the world is desperate for a stabilizing force, a voice that is strong yet fair, ambitious yet principled. India can be that voice, and so the Alaska summit should not be seen as just another diplomatic event. It should be remembered as the moment when India crossed the invisible line between influence and authority. That line is crucial. Influence means people listen to you. Authority means they cannot move without you. That is the new reality. So let us be honest with ourselves. This was not luck. This was not charity. This was the result of decades of persistence, of resilience, of refusing to be underestimated. India stood firm, and now it stands tall. And the world will never look at it the same way again. The message is clear. When you refuse to play small, when you carry yourself with strength and independence, the world has no choice but to adjust. That is as true for nations as it is for individuals, and that is why the Alaska Summit, it is not just a game changer for India, it is a game changer for how every Indian must now think about the future. Because the future does not belong to those who wait. It belongs to those who step forward when the world is watching, and India has finally stepped forward. When people talk about the Alaska Summit, they often reduce it to just another battle between Washington and Beijing. The United States on one side, China on the other, two heavyweights colliding with words instead of fists. But what most people fail to see is that the real drama, the real turning point, was not in the clash itself. It was in the silence that followed, in the realization that there was a third voice in the room that neither side could ignore. That voice was India. For decades, the story of global power was told as if it were a two-player game. The Cold War was America versus the Soviet Union. The new century was framed as America versus China, but the Alaska Summit disrupted that narrative. Suddenly, it wasn't just about who would dominate, it was about who would listen to India. That shift is subtle, but it is revolutionary, because the moment you are no longer framed as an outsider, but as the one shaping the balance, you have moved from the margins to the center. What India managed to do was extraordinary. It refused to be pulled into the gravity of either camp. It stood there, balanced but firm, making it clear that it would not be reduced to a pawn in someone else's strategy, and that independence is what made both Washington and Beijing pause. They realized that without India's cooperation, without India's participation, neither of their grand strategies could be complete. The United States cannot build a coalition of democracies without India. And China cannot expand its vision of economic dominance without India's markets and resources. Both of them need India more than India needs them. That is power. But here is where the psychological depth of this moment comes in. When two giants fight, the natural instinct of smaller nations is to hide, to align with one side for protection, or to stay out of the way altogether. India chose a different path. It looked both giants in the eye and said, "You will not define me, I will define myself." That is not just strategy, that is philosophy. It is the philosophy of self-respect, of sovereignty, of refusing to let fear dictate your choices. And when you project that kind of psychological strength, the world listens. Think about it like this. In a weightlifting competition, there are always two strongest athletes who capture everyone's attention. The audience assumes the gold will go to one of them. But then, out of nowhere, a third competitor shows up, not only lifting the weight but doing it with flawless form, calm and controlled. Suddenly, the conversation changes. Suddenly, the audience starts to wonder, maybe this is the one we underestimated. Maybe this is the one who changes everything. That is exactly what happened in Alaska. India was that competitor. And here's the most fascinating part. Neither the United States nor China wanted to admit it openly, but both were recalculating. You could see it in the way their tone shifted, in the way they moderated their words, in the way they began to leave space for India's position in the conversation. They may not say it out loud, but deep down they both understood that without India there is no balance, there is no stability, there is no future blueprint that holds. That recognition, even if unspoken, was the true achievement of the Alaska Summit. Now, let's talk about why this matters for the world. The U.S. and China represent two very different models of power. One is built on the promise of democracy and alliances, the other on centralized control and economic expansion. For years, nations felt they had to choose between these two paths, but India's stance introduces a third option. It says to the world, you do not have to be trapped in their struggle. You can be independent, you can be strong, you can pursue your own destiny. That message is liberating, not just for India, but for every nation that refuses to be swallowed by superpower politics. And this is where the deeper lesson lies. True leadership is not about siding with the strongest voice in the room. It is about creating a new path when no one else has the courage to. India did not take America's side. India did not take China's side. It took its own side. That is leadership in its purest form, and that is why the Alaska Summit is remembered as a turning point. Because once a nation demonstrates it has the strength to define its own destiny, it can never again be forced into silence. Of course, this independence comes with risk. Both the U.S. and China will test India's resolve. They will tempt, they will pressure, they will attempt to sway decisions, but the stronger the resistance, the stronger the respect, and respect is the currency of power. Not money, not weapons, not even technology. Respect. When nations respect you, they consult you. When they respect you, they cannot ignore you. And when they respect you, they know the game cannot be played without you. That is the position India has achieved. A swing state, yes, but more than that, the stabilizer of the global order. The one that can tilt the balance, but also the one that can keep it from collapsing. That role is rare. That role is historic. So let us be absolutely clear, the Alaska Summit was not a battle between two superpowers, it was the unveiling of a third. The world expected fireworks between America and China, but what they got was something far more important, the recognition that India has arrived as a decisive voice in shaping the 21st century, and here is the closing truth. Power is not always about being the loudest. Sometimes it is about being the voice that cannot be ignored. India became that voice, and when the two most powerful nations in the world have to adjust their steps because of you, you are no longer following the game. You are changing it. When you look at the Alaska Summit from the outside, it is easy to focus only on the politics, the arguments, the strategic positioning, the clash of words. But what made this summit truly historic for India was something deeper. It was the way economic and technological power suddenly came into focus, not as side issues, but as the very foundation of influence. And in this arena, India is no longer simply a participant. India is becoming a gatekeeper of the future. Think about the global economy today. The United States is driven by its corporations, its tech giants, its financial institutions. China is driven by its manufacturing, its supply chains, its ability to scale production. But what is often overlooked is how India sits at the crossroads of both of these worlds. It has a young, ambitious workforce that the world cannot ignore. It has digital infrastructure that is growing faster than almost anywhere else. It has a consumer market of over 1 billion people that no corporation, no matter how powerful, can afford to bypass. And more importantly, it has the ability to set the rules of engagement for anyone who wants access. At the Alaska Summit, this became clear in subtle ways. Discussions about trade, about technology, about energy, all circled back to one question: where does India stand? Will India allow certain technologies in? Will it partner with this bloc or that bloc on semiconductors, on artificial intelligence, on clean energy? These were not small questions. They were the questions that determined whether the next decade would belong to one camp or another. That is how critical India has become, and this is where the psychological depth of the moment lies. Economic power is not just about GDP numbers or trade balances. Those are statistics on paper. Real economic power is about leverage. It is about the ability to say yes or no and have the world adjust accordingly. When India decides not to open its market to certain technologies, that decision ripples across continents. When India decides to build new trade corridors, entire regions are reoriented. That kind of influence is not accidental. It is earned through years of growth, discipline, and independence. Now, let me put it to you in personal terms. Imagine you are in a negotiation, and everyone at the table needs what you have. They might have more money, they might have more experience, but without your consent the deal cannot move forward. How do you feel in that moment? You feel powerful, yes, but you also feel the weight of responsibility. Because every choice you make has consequences far beyond yourself. That is exactly the position India is stepping into. It is no longer just about what India gains, it is about what direction the world takes depending on India's choices. Technology is the perfect example. The digital age is not about who has the biggest factories anymore. It is about who controls data, who builds the algorithms, who creates the platforms that shape how billions of people think and act. And here, India holds a unique position. With the largest open internet market in the world, India is not only a consumer but a regulator, a testing ground, and a partner for innovation. Companies from Silicon Valley to Shenzhen cannot succeed globally without passing through India. That reality gives India a kind of veto power over the future of technology, and that power was felt in Alaska. You could sense it in the way U.S. officials spoke of collaboration on critical technologies, in the way China emphasized trade routes and supply chains. They were both aware that India's decision on whether to align or remain neutral could tilt the balance of the entire technological race. This is leverage, and leverage once gained must be used wisely. Here's the deeper lesson. Economic and technological strength are not just about prosperity. They are about dignity. When you have leverage, you do not have to beg. You do not have to compromise your values for short-term gains. You can stand firm, knowing that others need you as much as you need them. That sense of dignity transforms not just governments but entire populations. People begin to walk taller, to see themselves as equals in the global community, not subordinates. And that change in self-perception is as powerful as any trade deal or investment. But let's not mistake this for a moment of rest. With great leverage comes constant testing. Others will try to use India's markets, its technology, its people, for their own benefit. The temptation to sign away independence in exchange for quick rewards will always be there, and that is why discipline is so important. Discipline to say no when the deal undermines sovereignty. Discipline to invest in your own people, your own technology, your own future, rather than depending too heavily on outside promises. Discipline to think long-term, even when the short-term rewards look appealing. Because true greatness is not built in one summit, it is built through consistent decisions repeated over years that gradually shift the balance of power in your favor. The Alaska summit showed the world that India has already reached that turning point. But what comes next depends on whether India can continue to harness its economic and technological leverage without losing its independence. And here is the part that should inspire every individual listening. This principle is not just for nations, it is for you. You may not sit at an international summit, but you do sit at tables of negotiation every day, in your career, in your family, in your community. You too have leverage, even if you do not always see it. You too have something others need, something only you can offer. The key is recognizing it, valuing it, and refusing to give it away too cheaply. That is how respect is earned, that is how influence is built. So let us understand what Alaska revealed. India is not just a market, it is not just a buyer or a seller, it is the architect of the new economic and technological order. The summit showed the world that without India, the pieces don't fit. And once you become the one holding the missing piece, you are no longer waiting for permission. You are setting the terms. That is the essence of real power. Not to be consumed by others' games, but to design the board on which the game is played. And that is what India began to do in Alaska. The closing truth is simple. Wealth without independence is weakness. Technology without dignity is dependency. But when a nation combines economic strength with the courage to decide its own path, it does not just prosper, it leads. And that is the opportunity now before India. Up to this point, we've talked about strategy, about geopolitics, about economics and technology. But let me tell you something, none of that matters if a nation does not believe in itself. The greatest breakthroughs in history don't begin in boardrooms or parliaments, they begin in the mind. And what the Alaska summit gave India, more than any trade deal or political agreement, was a moment of psychological transformation. It was a mirror held up to the world, and for the first time the reflection staring back said, India is not just rising, India has arrived. This might sound symbolic, but symbolism shapes reality. The way a nation sees itself dictates how it acts, how it invests, how it takes risks, and how it treats its people. For years, India's role in the global conversation was framed as the future power, always tomorrow, always almost there, always emerging. But in Alaska, that narrative broke. India was treated not as the power of tomorrow, but as a power of today. And that recognition, that validation, is not just external, it becomes internal. It seeps into the national psyche and changes the way people think about what is possible. When you walk into a room and no one expects much from you, you hold yourself differently, you speak with hesitation, you second, guess, but when you walk into a room and people turn to you, waiting for your words, your posture changes. Your voice steadies, you begin to feel that you belong. That shift in identity is what India experienced at the Alaska summit. And when a nation begins to feel that sense of belonging on the global stage, its people start to carry themselves differently. Students dream bigger, entrepreneurs take bolder risks, leaders make stronger decisions. That is the true power of psychology. It multiplies everything else, but we have to be careful here. Confidence can be a double-edged sword. There is healthy confidence, the kind that pushes you forward, that makes you work harder, that strengthens your resolve. And then there is arrogance, the kind that blinds you to challenges, that makes you careless, that causes you to fall. The test for India now is to turn this newfound recognition into confidence, not arrogance, to take pride without losing humility, to embrace ambition without forgetting discipline. That balance is what separates nations that rise temporarily from those that rise permanently. Think about the great athletes of the world. When they win their first championship, the feeling is incredible. The recognition, the applause, the headlines, it all tells them they are finally the best. But here is the truth. Winning once does not make you great. It is staying great that does, and the only way to stay great is to channel that recognition into motivation, to work harder after victory than before it. To use the validation not as a finish line, but as fuel for the next climb. That is the moment India faces now. The Alaska summit was the first championship. The question is, can India build a dynasty? And here's where philosophy enters the picture. Greatness is not just external, it is internal. It is not just about how others see you, but about how you see yourself when no one is watching. India's true transformation will not be decided by applause at international summits, but by the quiet determination in classrooms, in laboratories, in small villages where young people look in the mirror and say, I am part of a nation that leads. That mindset shift, multiplied by millions, becomes unstoppable, but let us not underestimate the importance of moments like Alaska. Every movement in history has a spark, a moment where people realize they are capable of more than they thought. For the United States, it was the moon landing, a moment that told Americans they could achieve the impossible. For India, the Alaska summit is such a moment. It told every citizen, you are not just participants in the world order, you are authors of it. That is a radical redefinition of identity, and with identity comes responsibility, because once you see yourself as a leader, you cannot go back to playing small. Once you are recognized as a central power, you cannot afford to act like a follower. The world is watching, yes, but more importantly, your own people are watching, and when the people believe, they expect action, they expect courage, they expect their leaders to live up to the image of strength and independence that the world now associates with India. This expectation is not a burden, it is a gift because it forces a nation to grow into its potential. Now, I want you to imagine something. Imagine a young Indian student sitting in a small town reading about the Alaska summit. For the first time, that student feels proud in a way that goes beyond history or culture. Proud because the present, not just the past, is a source of strength. That feeling plants a seed, that seed becomes ambition. And that ambition, multiplied across millions of young minds, is what builds the future. This is the ripple effect of psychological turning points. They don't just change how the world sees you, they change how you see yourself. So yes, Alaska was about power. Yes, it was about geopolitics. Yes, it was about economics and technology. But above all, it was about psychology. It was about India stepping into its own reflection and finally seeing not potential, but presence. And that shift will echo long after the summit is forgotten because it changes how every Indian measures what is possible. The challenge now is simple: to protect this moment, to nurture it, to turn it into momentum. Not to rest on recognition, but to use it as the foundation of something greater. Because nations, like individuals, must grow into the confidence they earn. They must prove worthy of the respect they are given. And that is exactly what India must do now. The closing truth is this: the world has recognized India. That is important, but what matters even more is whether India recognizes itself, whether it accepts not only the applause, but also the responsibility that comes with it. Because when you see yourself clearly, when you embrace your own strength with humility and purpose, nothing can stop you. India is no longer waiting to be invited into the future. It is already there. The only question left is how boldly it will step forward.